What occupies most sculptors, and in no specific order, is shape, form, material, line, scale, color, finish, balance, balance suggesting potentially buoyant form, and even aerodynamics. Figurative sculptors, including abstract figurative, are interested in the body, human body, corporeality. Bob Grosvenor, for all his transformed cars, clearly has an interest in the auto body. And as we can see here with this car's visually lush and seductive chromatics, there's a great attention to color and how it amplifies the contours and profiles of these bodies. A car's finish is its second skin. A couple weeks ago, here at the opening of the show, someone told me that she mentioned a new car to Bob, maybe it was a Tesla, having real enthusiasm for it, which Bob didn't seem to share. I think she said Bob told her he wasn't that interested in cars. Now keep in mind, this was against the backdrop of the work before us. She was perplexed. After all, Bob has made any number of sculptures that are clearly transformed cars. We're going to have a few images of them. But a car is only a jumping off point for Bob from something known that is meant to be taken elsewhere. In the end, whatever Bob does with an object is sculpture. What else could it be? Although that woman was perplexed, I'm not, and you shouldn't be either. What I understand from looking at Bob's art for a long time now, with works dating back to the mid to late 1960s, is that he sees art as a vehicle for thought. Think about that. Beyond conceptual art from my school days, it might not have occurred to me to apply this view more widely to all sorts of things that artists do, not if I hadn't followed the course of Bob's work over all this time. It's true, the best artists allow us to come along for the ride. And not only is art the vehicle, it's also the highway, with all its lanes to choose from, on and off ramps. Some artists exit and never come back, with shoulders and curves to glide through, traversed by drivers who are infinitely skilled and those who might have gotten their license from a bubblegum machine. And that's not a reference to art school. Of course, we aren't only along for the ride. Once the artists have made their work, we get to slide over behind the wheel. The art becomes our vehicle for thought, wherever it may take us. So, up on the screen now is the earliest work. It's 1966. It's called Tenerife, and it just seems to float in the room. I mean, there's some ways that it's supported from the ceiling, but they're basically invisible. And he wanted this space between the ceiling and the object and the floor. He really likes to see things hover, even if they're just a few inches off the floor. That slight raise does something. Well, that's 1966. This is untitled. It's made between 1968 and 1970. What you're seeing is a reconstruction from, when was that show in Miami? Like 4 years ago?
Yeah, 4 years ago, I think, yeah.
And in fact, this piece, every time it's shown, it hasn't been shown that many times, but I think he's built it probably 3 different times. It's always built each time. And it's always a little bit different. And again, you see, well, here you can really see the supports, but it's hovering in the space. You can walk under it, and it's just buoyant and floating. So that's 68 to 70. This is 1969. Karma has shown this. It's called the three-wheeled car. And I believe he made it initially for his daughter, who was very young at the time. So this part at the top lifts, and you can get in there. It's a very small space, but she was a child. She could get in there, and it moves. And again, you really see the hover. It's just a couple of inches off the ground. There's very little clearance. And another shot of that, oops, straight on. One thing I want to mention is, because of this period, 66, 7, 8, 9, people thought he was a minimalist. Bob Grosvenor is not a minimalist, and that became really clear a few years later when his work started to develop into other kinds of objects that were, you could say the forms were reductive, but they were something else, and he didn't have this kind of, what do you call it, like seriality repetition where he was like a Judd, where he was doing infinite variations on things. In a way, with Bob, what's interesting is every single work, it's like he's starting over. It's a new step. It's something else, because like a lot of art, well, not all artists, but he wants to stay engaged from one work to another. And he does. And he's also, I'd say, we're looking at things 66, 7, 8, 9. It's 2024. He still has an audience of young people. Like, people come to his work and discover it and are into it, as you can see. And I don't think that's really true for so many artists of his generation. He's a 60s artist in the 60s, a 70s, and he's an artist today, right? He transcends all those periods because he's always been doing his own thing. This is the Aero car. It's precarious because you can sit there and you have to kind of balance, and there's an engine on the back. I mean, I really think you can't go down the street in it, although I think they did. Karma also showed this piece. That's the Aero car 2014. Bob spent a lot of his time on the water when he was a kid, but also in the Florida Keys for a long time. And this is it's just incredible. Whatever is on the back of that thing, I mean, it almost looks like a weapon. It's so gnarly and it's so weird. And that's something else that's really interesting, is that his work for a long time, it just kept getting weirder. And I don't know that if he was here, he wouldn't get up in front of you and tell you what it's about, what's it about. It's just, it's visually a very interesting object. And for him, art has always got to be a visual thing. It seems like a simple thing to say, but it's a huge point, I think. So that was 2014. This is also 2014. And this is one work, the 3 cars that he's altered. You can kind of see from the car on the left in yellow, there's no headlights. He's kind of smoothed it over. Same thing on the far right. I have a little quote to read specific to this piece. It's a conversation he did with Alex Bacon in 2019. He said, "I've always loved the DAF, the Solito, and the Renault," which is to the right. "Nobody particularly likes that car, but I like it. And I thought maybe I can make it a little better by doing this and that. Maybe I could make it interesting. I always wanted to put a fin on the back of that car, which I did. And then the car in the middle, which is just such an eccentric thing, it just had to go in the middle. Then the car on the left, the DAF, is a Dutch car that nobody ever liked, but I always sort of thought it was cool in a way, so I smoothed it out a little bit, and I felt they looked good together, the 3. He has a very simple way of saying what he's doing, and I can't improve on that. That's also at Karma. Is that already like 8 years ago? And I didn't even know about this piece. He showed this in Belgium. It's from 3 years ago. It's untitled. And it's just a fiberglass shell of the car, and he painted it and set it directly on the ground. That's something else that's interesting in relation to this show. Probably as you came in, you saw the black wall piece. So it becomes this anchor for the car, and I think something similar happens in terms of an anchor or balance. He likes to put some other object there in the room, because he really does think of the room. It's not just an object and he puts it there. He's thinking about the architecture. He's thinking about how you're going to be in the room with it and move around. And then, oops, wrong direction. This was at Karma year or so ago in LA. One thing that's important, you may not notice right away, he had the wall behind and the floor under it painted silver. So it has a kind of stage. There's something interesting too that I think about with minimal art. There was, different critics spoke about its theatricality. I never saw it. I think that was kind of made up. It's as nicely as I can put it. But I think there's an element of theatricality in Bob's work. And we're not looking at a whole bunch of pieces from the 2000s where they really seem like objects creating their own theater as a stage set and so on. But yeah, the silver wall and floor is a really important part of the green car. And there's another view. He's done something similar with the headlights, which are painted out as they are here, and hubcaps. And that's straight on. Such a weird thing. And then finally, have a look for a second. I know you saw it when you came in, but the sculpture that's here in the middle of the room, just have a look at this, because this is where it started out.
Mm-hmm.
It's very different. This is out of his kind of Quonset hut, one of his work sheds out at his place on Long Island. I like that picture, very Back to the Future. But that's what this was, to give you, I think, more of an appreciation of where it was taken. And, oh yeah, hi.
Hi.
All right. So both of you, I'd like to get a general sense of what it is that Bob does, because I don't really know. And if you'd lead your remarks in the direction of the works in the gallery, starting with Mark, since you've interacted with Bob back when you were in Florida, you interviewed him for the catalog of the Miami show, and you're both sculptors.
I think, yeah, so the thing that I mean, and I've always kind of loved Bob's work, but I think he does this thing that he takes this object that we know, I suppose, this car. For example, we're starting here with a car. He doesn't always take an object, you know, but there's something about this, the familiarity and the strangeness of this object. And I think he's able to kind of take us into a kind of process, his process, I suppose, this process of looking and discovering and knowing and not knowing, which I think he's all about, and that curiosity of that. And I think that there's something also about he's extraordinarily thorough as an artist. He's the most thorough artist I can even think of, in the sense that he's solely committed to his practice in his own way, in his own time. Like all of the rest of us are kind of rushing and being pushed and twisted. He just doesn't do any of that. He says as little as he needs to say. He does as much as he needs to do, or as little as he needs to do. He's fully confident in that. But then he allows us to kind of travel with him through these works. And I feel like earlier today I was here looking at this piece, and there's these beautiful kind of subtleties to this piece. And the more time you spend with it, you know, like there's a strange curve to the car. Like there's this weird thing where the hood is slightly lifted, the fenders slightly come down. There's this strange, very, very subtle curved line that you see rolling across the car. You feel the center of it kind of almost fall down on itself. You know, the fact that the wheel at the front is a tiny bit smaller than the wheel at the back. The tires are slightly different sizes. These tiny, tiny details that you kind of discover over time that kind of create this extraordinary sculpture. And it's sculpture because it's sculpture because it's sculpture, but it's sculpture also because it's speaking this kind of language that I think kind of lets you in and confuses you at the same time. So that puzzling thing, I think, is the kind of the key. I suppose to me is the kind of the key to it all.
Randy, I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
I'm going to ask you, since it's a question I've borrowed from Mark from that interview with Bob, and also because you're a writer. Does Bob's work make you wonder about where life ends and art begins, or where they entwine around one another?
It makes me think a little bit about, thinking about what he did early on and then thinking about this makes me think about that quote from Guston when he began his late figurative paintings, and he said, I got tired of all that purity. I wanted to tell stories. And you think, he moved from these forms that were that weren't so much referencing the world. Although when I look at those early pieces, I think about Kubrick in 2001, and maybe he was making some references at that point to objects that he'd seen elsewhere. But then when he started to move into, sort of like trailers and things that enclose water, like tubs and things like that, and it feels like there's some narrative that he wants you to think about that's about life, even though you could come up with 100 different narratives. Like when I first saw this car, I thought about that scene in Bonnie and Clyde when Warren Beatty and Faye Dunaway are in the car and Gene Wilder gets in the car, and then at a certain point he tells them that he's an undertaker, and they slam on the brakes and they throw him out of the car because it was like bad luck to have an undertaker in the car because it could lead to death or something. And I'm sure that none of those narratives are what he wants you to think about, but if you see a dark car like this that has been what, I was telling Mark this earlier, and I learned this from Richard Prince, when you take all the chrome on a car and you cover it over with black, it's called murdering out the car. Mm-hmm. It's been murdered out. And there's no way to me to see a car like this and then to see the work on the back wall, that's a really, a spectral black line, and not to make narratives about it. But then again, I read interviews with him where he talks about he makes a lot of work that he never shows, and you think he's one of those artists who, he loves the built world and he loves found objects, and he likes trying to figure out how they're made and then making them as a way of seeing like, oh, do I want to look at this? And maybe he keeps things in the studio that he loves to look at that he thinks, I love to look at it, but I shouldn't show it because it's not right for the rest of the world. But making all these objects over and over just to see what they look like, which I guess all artists do to some degree, but it feels like he has this process of just looking out in the world and either finding something or remaking something and doing it over and over and over, tweaking it a little bit to figure out like, oh, that just makes me happy to look at.
And he does make it better. There are all sorts of people who are really into old cars and putting them back the way they were exactly.
Yeah.
And there's, the whole culture of these old, they're all connected up to each other, also because they need parts and so on.
Yeah.
But I don't think any car people do that. He's an artist. He's not like a car person.
Right.
But he is a tinkerer. He does like to.
It also makes me think of Chris Burden and how, when he would make like a small replica of a bridge or make those skyscrapers out of erector sets. That was him just trying to figure out like, how does a bridge work? How does a skyscraper work? And it's not so much with Bob about the functionality of it, but it just seems like he wants to make it for himself to get a sense of like, what is this thing? I got to make it to figure out what it is.
I think there's also this funny thing of this sort of like there's almost like a commonality with all those thousands or millions of tinkerers who are all kind of doing the same thing, all in different ways. And I think that is a kind of language of making art is somehow part of it too. That kind of that method, which is not, yes, he does drawings and things too, but this is a very different kind of method of work that somehow aligns him with all these other kind of people who are, and again that sense of like, when you talk about is it art, is it not art, and I don't think Bob really cares. He's really happy with it being either. He certainly wouldn't say it's art, and he wouldn't say it's not art. He'd say that there's this place where these things, where it's all overlapping and intertwining.
Do you know, from both of you having visited him, when he started working on cars, does he have any kind of back and forth or conversation with people who are, car detailer, car painter, body work people? Because you think there would be those guys in that field who would like absolutely love this thing.
Yeah.
Because it's also just technically, it's beautifully done.
I almost feel he probably wouldn't, because he's sort of like, because he's like that, he probably wouldn't, like when he says, I'm not really into cars, he's kind of like, because he's kind of not, he's into cars and not into cars. He's into this car, he's into this
Did either of you think about, he's done quite a few pieces based on cars. It's the first one where you get a sense of somebody who might have been behind the wheel or would get behind the wheel, because I don't know if everyone noticed from the front, but he either removed the windshield or it wasn't there and he didn't put it back, but there's no windshield. So what does he drape over the steering wheel? A pair of goggles, which almost like something out of what's the Australian movie?
Mad
Max.
Max.
Okay.
Mad Max. Yeah.
So there's no
Yeah.
windshield, but
Right.
there's goggles.
Yeah.
Because also, it has an engine and it runs. So it's a working car.
And I was telling Mark, I think this is right, that for when in Demolition Derby, you don't have a windshield in because it would crack and you wouldn't be able to see. So you're in a car like that,
but
probably
eventually-
with a helmet and goggles on, because the windshield would be a bad
Yeah.
idea.
Well,
I mean, I also love the idea that you come in from the back, the way it's placed in the space, and that we come in and we get this extraordinary kind of like plane of lush purple coming down, and then these blackened windows that sort of don't let you in, and you're kind of forced around to here, and then you go in. It's almost like you're taken on this circuitous journey, and then you go in through the front.
From this picture, it looks like it did have a windshield.
Yeah.
I don't think that that's plastic. So we took it out.
Yeah, and this is also the kind of car that would be in a Demolition Derby.
Yeah.
It's like an old,
But then it's this kind of like, it's like you could almost, it's the colors so lush and rich and sensuous. It's like a sort of candy hearse. You could eat it. It's
Right.
almost like,
Yeah.
there's something really, which is different than the other cars too. This kind of immaculate finish,
Yeah.
which is, it's kind of going somewhere else almost.
Yeah. And as I was saying earlier, like this would fit right in on stage at a ZZ Top concert.
Yeah. No, I know.
With
Yeah.
smoke coming out of it.
Right. Yeah.
Mark, in your interview with Bob, you referred to objects as realities. You kind of
Right.
touched on that a minute ago. Things in the world, things that are known.
Yeah.
And, lots of artists take things that we know and really defamiliarize themselves. He's doing something else. It's still what it was, but it's in this heightened reality.
So I was, it's funny.
visuality.
So I was thinking of this. There's this terrible phrase from someone none of us love, Donald Rumsfeld. We called it the unknown known.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
right.
And I kind of feel like there's something about that in Bob's work where you know it so well, but you just don't know it. And the fact that you think you know it makes the business of not knowing it even more intriguing.
Yeah.
It kind of takes you even further. And I kind of think that's why he works with these with these things taken from the world, it's from all of our conversations. Like it's not like you can come in here and say, I don't know what this is. I kind of know what it is. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
really close. I can
Right.
kind of see all these things. I can see
know
the
what
handle.
it is. That's one
Yeah.
of the great things about art.
Yeah.
You know what it is, but you still say, what is that?
Yeah.
It's happening in your brain exactly at the same
But he doesn't give
time.
you all those excuses that a lot of other sculpture does, where you'd be like, what is that? You can't
Right.
really, that doesn't really apply. It sort of applies and doesn't apply. So you kind of end up on this like strange journey, which I suppose is what I alluded to earlier, which I really love, is that he's sort of letting you travel with him on this journey of discovery of this thing. You kind of become a little bit of a Bob when you take the time and you get obsessed with the object. You kind of go down the kind of the Bob rabbit hole, and you're kind of suddenly a little bit, I think, living through his eyes,
Yeah.
which is really an extraordinary experience.
And for me, he's way up there in the pantheon of artists who just will really, really resist talking about the work, in the way that like John Wesley or Bruce Nauman or like Via Selmans, they just really resist trying to explain it, partly because, like I think in the case of Wesley, I don't think he could really. He wouldn't, or he would feel like trying to do it would just be an approximation. And it seems the same way. I mean, I haven't read it, every interview with Grosvenor, but when it comes down to talking about, sort of meaning and all that kind of stuff, he just skips out and just starts talking about how he made something, or why he wanted it to be a certain distance off the floor or something. But he's really not explaining the objects, and that's always interesting to me because
he's kind of validating those meanings, I think, a little bit too, which is what's
Yeah.
funny about him. Like, for example, I think Bob could genuinely talk about the quality of the light in the sky relative to the thing, and that has enormous meaning to him, or this thing. I mean, I think about it a lot, this idea of this horizon line, because in the Keys where the studio was, you're obviously on the ocean, you see really far. You see, I think, 11 miles or something in the ocean. And so your horizon line is much higher. It's way up. And so like in in their place in the Keys at the studio, you'd stand in this room in their house, and felt like the water was going to come right in. It was halfway up the window. It was extraordinary, and it's kind of the height of the black line there. I mean, it feels like this, and that sense that those elements are that everything else is the thing. I suppose that's kind of almost stupid to say, but it's that those things pertain very much to this object, all those other things.
Yeah.
Those other kind of experiences.
And hasn't he, Bob? Hasn't he also that work on the back? There were all these works that he did, and I don't remember in what period, that were just kind of like timbers that had been. I guess early on they were soaked in creosote.
That's right.
Which is kind of toxic or whatever, but like creosote was used on telephone poles and railroad ties to keep the wood from deteriorating. Mm-hmm. But they were just these like really, I mean, to me, they were kind of haunting objects. Mm-hmm. Because they were just these like, you knew it was wood, but it had this kind of deathly cast to it. And that to me, I don't know, it has a pretty deathly cast to it, and feels like it fits into that thing that he likes about, I don't know, these very simple wooden objects that are dark.
And yet it has this super looseness to the spray, just like the spray on the headlights or the spray on the wheels. There's this almost, it's polka-like. It's so relaxed in the way that it's done. I mean, it's heavy, and at the same time, it's got this strange kind of cloudy lightness, which is.
Yeah.
I mean, also like the wooden piece is like it's really just a plank screwed to the wall. It's not. And it's almost like you're gonna. Like a bumper or something, like the car's going to back into it or something you're going to, it feels like a stop or something in case something happens.
It's funny, sitting here where we are now, looking at it, and from what you were saying about the Keys, it looks like it's a horizon. Like it feels like we're looking at the car, on a road or driving along a beach, and that's the horizon.
Well, I mean, I think you see in his photographs, especially also the hot rod, the ones from the desert. The horizon in the desert's really high too, because it's so distant, and it does that thing of fading out as well.
Mark's referring to pictures that Bob took in, I guess it's Bonneville Salt Flats, where they would test very, very high performing cars, and like not sound barrier, but at incredible speeds. Mm-hmm. So he is interested in this movement, it's phenomenal, right? Yeah. And I think about that. It's not, okay, it's phenomenal, his work is phenomenal in terms of like, the wow factor. But I think there's also the aspect of it being phenomenological. It's involved with observation and experience, because as he always goes back to it, it's a visual thing. Yeah. And it has a certain weight, because even the pieces that hang, they're buoyant, they're there, but they still have a mass. Yeah. Maybe it's like a displaced mass, which is also a car speeding through the desert.
I mean, there's something also with those photos from and they're doing like land speed records, but there's something also about that business, even of the people doing that, the idea that you would chase this thing it's meaningful, but kind of has no meaning at the same time. Yeah. That you kind of devote your life to driving a car at 400 miles an hour on the salt flats, and it's this kind of obsessive behavior surrounding these strange kind of handmade objects. There's something about that. It's not unlike being an artist in a way. This pursuing this kind of, making this decision in your life to pursue this kind of strange dream that's a little bit kind of quixotic or something. It's kind of hard to kind of achieve the thing that's going to be achieved.
And also visually out there, it's like an artist's dream, because it's just a blank, mm-hmm. It's just a blank nothing, and no matter whatever you do on it, you've got, there's nothing else.
There's nothing else, and there's light, there's all of those elements that kind of.
Right, yeah. One thing to me that's been important, or the reason I love him so much is, to me, a lot of the work, it's funny. It's like there's a certain kind of real deadpan. To me, even though I know a lot of the cars aren't American and some of these references aren't American to design, it feels like a very kind of American type of deadpan humor in what he does. That makes me think a little bit of Baldessari, and it makes me think of Chris Burden, because Burden could also be really, really funny in his own way and in the way he thought about himself as an artist. And when I look at, that to me,
They're cartoon cars.
they're the Three Stooges in a way. They're kind of, they do have a cartoon thing to them. You can't look at those and not kind of smile. And then, like this book that I have, the pictures, to me, a lot of those are just, when he has like a donut sitting on the surface of the water. I mean, those are all, it's a really specific kind of humor.
Well, he's amusing himself in the way that in all his work, he's only has himself to please. I don't think he thinks about an audience. And he likes that people come to his work. And as we were saying before, he doesn't speak about his work, but, we've had, now like at least 40 years of artists who are really wanting to drive the narrative around their work, right? Which maybe comes from art school. You're supposed to be able to explain what you're doing, okay. He's interested in what other people have to say about what he does. I feel like in the interview with you, he started asking you.
No, that's the thing. And he was also, when there was a time we went down, Darren and I went down to visit them in the Keys, and we were there and we were swimming behind his house, and Bob got into this little boat, and it was a glitter boat. It was covered in glitter, and he put it in the water, and he was paddling around in the boat, or maybe had a little engine, and as the boat went along, there was like a trail of glitter behind it because all the glitter was coming off, and I was like, and I said to him afterwards, "Is that a piece?" He's like, "Oh no, it's just a boat. It's just a boat. It's just a boat." And you're like, it's so not just a boat. Yeah. It's so something completely other.
Doing it completely for his own satisfaction.
Yeah, but then you also feel stupid saying, "Well, what a stupid thing to say is that a piece?" Because you already did it. That already happened. Like there's a sense, I think, to his work, I suppose, that you're kind of in it, which I kind of really love. That's I suppose what I mean when I say it's so thorough. You feel like an idiot asking like where the work is, because you already know. You've already kind of had that experience.
Well, and it's interesting to me too, like a lot of, I think this is right, isn't it, Bob? That a lot of the early work, because it was made out of plywood, doesn't exist, and a lot of the work that he makes in the studio just never ever sees the light of day or might not exist. And I think maybe in the essay in here or somewhere you wrote about like they take their place in the permanent collection of the ephemeral museum, like Hammond's or like the snowballs or whatever. And you get that sense sometimes that yes, he wants to make objects that will endure, but he's also really, really happy just making things that might never
people
see the light
who
of day.
Work with objects, and especially when they put different objects together, a kind of life-size, three-dimensional collage, right? They have a lot of stuff around. And so until something kind of comes out in front of them and joins something else, you don't see something happening. And then maybe when something does start to happen, you're not really happy with it, and it gets set aside.
Right.
And he does that a lot. I gave dates to some of these pieces, but like maybe he had some of these cars for a long time before the three of them converged, and before he started to see that there was a possibility there.
Or even there was that scooter in the show at the Renaissance Society in Chicago, that orange scooter.
He just used it as a scooter.
Yeah, he just used it as a scooter. Yeah. So then it's part of the fees, and I was like, oh, that's such a, I've made pieces because I think it's such a great, part of the sculpture. He's like, oh no, that's just a scooter. I was just driving around on it, and then I just left it there against the wall.
Point,
you're kind of like, well,
At a certain point, the artist is looking at something and they say, oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
They themselves can give it another consideration.
Yeah.
But the scooter, we're talking about a scooter, which was next to a very large built concrete block piece. It's similar, the scooter has a similar function's the wrong word, as the black board here, and the same with the ball by the yellow fiberglass car.
Yeah.
But again, it's a kind of occupying space. It needs to be kind of held down.
Yeah.
I mean, there's also a kind of that beautiful sort of slightly happenstance magic thing to the way the scooter's propped against the wall, and in Bob's photographs, he's capturing that kind of happenstance magic out in the world all the time.
Yeah.
There's very
some he's arranging, right?
Yeah, and maybe sometimes he's kind of just setting up a situation where he catches it. Maybe when you drive a scooter and if you drive scooters, sometimes you prop it against the wall and it's brilliant.
Yeah.
I mean, it's like you kind of like.
It's
Some
like
of the thing, I'm sorry.
I was just not to mention Chris Burden too much, but I remember once I went to see him in Topanga, and they had so much. He and his wife Nancy Rubens had so much space there that they could just keep tons of junk. In that way that like you go around to towns and you just see like some guy who has a house, and then there's like 4 lots full of junk.
Yeah.
And that was what he said to me. He was like, I just keep stuff, and like, a lot of this has a good chance of making it into the art world, but you never know. It never knows what it's. And so it was like lampposts and cast iron objects and all this kind of stuff. But it's just he can look at them every day, and then at a certain point they start to say something or not. And I get the same sense a little bit about him having cars around. I don't know.
Yeah, your mention of magic a minute ago made me think that there's all sorts of things in his work that take us by surprise. But he was the first person to be surprised, he himself. And that's a really key ingredient element to making things,
Yeah, he's on the one hand he's letting it make itself, and on the other hand, it's funny. I think he's also extraordinarily. You talk about minimalist, which everyone does, but it's interesting because in a way, you could argue he's much more minimal than any of them were. He's so incredibly
Reductive.
Careful, right? I mean, he just pairs right back to what's absolutely necessary, and he takes enormous time to do it. You don't really catch minimalists taking 5 years to get a sculpture right, but he'll take 5 years or 20 years, and it'll until it's absolutely there. And then when it's there, it's there.
I've wondered, and I mean, this is maybe a question for you, Bob. Like this car, as I'm told, is functional. Mm-hmm. It's got the engine in it.
Not at night. He blacked out.
Not at night,
the
right?
Lights,
yeah. But
headlamps.
do you think that that's even though there's no way to know that it's intentional? I mean, that it's functional. That is it intentional? Do you think that like it matters to him that there was an engine in this one, just for himself, or it was just too hard to get the engine out, or I don't know, something like that?
It could be that it was already there.
I read some interviews with him. I mean, and I've heard him talk about this term that he talked about the motor of the sculpture. Yeah. But he's not referring to the motor. He's referring to the energy of the piece. Like they talking about some of those early pieces, the way they were fixed into the floor, where they float. That fixing point was the motor of the sculpture.
He talked about like looking at a Ronald Bladen sculpture and being like, ooh, that's where the motor is or something.
Which is such an interesting term, right? For that kind of the idea of a motor as a kind of energy. And in a sense that is, this is like, of course the motor's in the car because that kind of is the motor of the sculpture to some extent. But there's something about that idea of a kind of an implicit energy at the center of something that's kind of emanating out. Yeah.
Didn't he tell you that I think you maybe prompted him ask.
Yeah, you have to.
That he sees all of these things as alive.
Yeah, I think he does. I mean, no, he does see them as alive. He sees them in a sort of animistic way, I think, in a strange kind of way. He's very, I think it's which is part of that kind of humor of the thing too, a little bit like you were alluding to with those pieces, that there's this very, I mean, it's almost not what you would expect. There's something kind of like that on the one hand, he's incredibly spare, and on the other hand, he's got this, almost that like you said, almost like comic relationship to these things, that he can kind of almost see them. These are eyes on that those are eyes on that thing. I mean, look at that thing. That's a fish or something, or there's something kind of almost living in that thing.
Buggy.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. I was wondering also about this, for example, this vent on the front. So there's all these details on the car. Like there's an underscoop vent here. That's, I don't think.
It's not original.
It's not original.
This car's from 1938.
Yeah, so that's a Bob.
What's
Bob
the make?
Part.
Willys.
Oh, that was the maker.
Yes, that was the guy's name.
Huh.
They didn't become famous for cars. They ended up doing all the Jeeps in the Second World War.
I see.
But like all that brass handle that you just want to pull, like you want to just crank that handle and open the thing up, and there's all of this stuff that. Go ahead.
I haven't owned a car in 32 years, so I have no.
Oh, all right. Well, But I don't know
ability
that
to
it's
think
about being a car person, right? I think
Yeah.
these pieces are about the fact that cars are, the streets lined with cars. This is this
Yeah.
language. This is the most common language, if you like, of,
Right.
you know.
It's
And you'll
always
pass
sort
a
of
few classics. I walked from 11th Street over here. I think I passed 3 or 4 total classics on the way anyway, just casually like sitting around,
yeah. It's always kind of shocked me how few artists in the 20th century or 21st century, given, especially in America, the obsession with cars and the ubiquity of cars, how few artists actually deal with the car as a form. I mean, Richard Prince does. Chamberlain really didn't, because he didn't care about the car. He just cared about
Parts.
the material and the color. But there really aren't that many. I was racking my brain today trying to think about artists who have had any lasting engagement with the car as a form. There aren't that many, weirdly.
Well, in general, there's no one who does what he does
Yeah.
pretty much across from the 60s to now. The image that I have, I think the enduring image I have with this car is, if you took it out on the road and you were speeding along and a cop pulled you over, you would not get a ticket. Yeah. They would just be fascinated by this thing in front of them.
Yeah.
Like, what is that? And of course, you leave here tonight, every single car out there just looks like a boring pile of metal.
Yeah.
And with no personality.
Yeah.
Very few cars have any personality. They used to, 30s, 40s.
But there are quirky. I mean, it's like these. I mean, these are. He'll find the quirky one out there too.
Mm-hmm.
There was a little one of those early Honda electric cars on the street down the corner here. I'm sure he would take that. I mean, I think there's that. He's got that eye for these things. He's out looking and seeing, as we all are. I mean, we're all kind of looking and seeing as we walk around. That's what we do. But he really looks and he really sees. This
one is interesting to me because, and I could be wrong, but a lot of the ones that I've seen are brighter, they're reds or they're lighter colors, and this one, maybe not so much in daylight, but certainly in this light, and it's got all that black on it, and the purple is so dark, and then you're looking at that work behind it, and if it were black, it would feel hearse-like. It would really feel death-like, but it's not. It's a dark, dark purple that is almost black, but then the purple, of course, has all sorts of other illusions and things that it brings into it, and it's playful, and it kind of looks like rock and roll.
And it's slightly metallic, I think, too, in the daylight. In the daylight, you get this incredible, when I was here earlier, you get this the roof light, the skylight is reflecting in the car, but the car, it reflects in every corner that's not a corner. There are no corners because the thing's so rounded. So at every point where it sort of folds over, you get this kind of, these diamonds of the thing going on. I mean, it's quite extraordinary.
I think we have time for a few questions. If they actually are questions, would be interesting to hear them.
Was there like a moment where he was like cars? Or did it evolve? I don't really know the history of it.
He talked about that. I think I remember him talking about it in an interview, and it might have had to do with Florida, or of maybe keeping some around or something, and seeing them.
I know that maybe, I don't know actually. I don't know kind of when the first car pieces emerged. Yeah, it could be. I mean, it's a very different kind of environment, and it's.
Yeah. Yeah.
Listening to you all speak right now, and this notion of the purple and the black line, just the term of mortality comes to mind, and just, wondering, I mean, we're a bit younger, and than Bob, and looking at this earlier work, it's brighter and lighter, and it does have a sense of humor, but anyway, I never thought of this loose black funny line and this purple.
I don't think he's thinking about that.
Mortality.
No, I don't think so. No.
I don't know.
I
I
just
think
don't.
maybe
Although
he is a little bit.
Car. It's a very old car. I mean, it's interesting how this car is kind of. I don't know what year this car's from, but it's not new, right? It's older
38.
than a lot. It's from 38.
Yeah.
Right. So
there's also
But
something.
now it's in 2024.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not like.
But there's also something a little like in a movie noir about this car. Of like you could, imagine a gangster pulling up in this car
Yeah.
with a machine gun
Yes.
or something.
Yeah,
I mean,
totally.
there's
Yeah,
all,
yeah, yeah.
again, you could spin all these
Audience-
things out of it.
audience Participation time. Yes.
Oh, sorry.
I feel like humor has come up several times tonight, but when I look at the images and what's next to this piece, what comes to me, what's most salient to me is menace. And I was
Minutes.
and I was wondering if menace was ever an issue for him, like deliberately, because I'm just curious to know about that. And I was thinking about also in terms of the purple as opposed to if this was black, because I feel like it's actually more mysterious because it is purple as opposed to if it was black. But there's almost a menace in that history. Maybe I'm reading into it, but I don't know. Any thoughts about that?
Well, from mortality to menace, I
I
would
think
say,
it's
hold
definitely
on.
badass though. It's badass, I
Yeah.
would say, for sure.
1937 and the cars from 1938?
I would say that throughout Bob's work, the way I see it, he's been in touch with his younger self all the way through. You know, there's some aspect of Bob which is still 15 years old. There's some aspect of Bob which is still like a 20-year, you know, but that's also something that's interesting about art, right?
But I guess I was thinking about it in relationship to like the powerboat image that you showed.
I would
Right.
say yes,
And,
that's
and
menace.
even that very first piece, I mean, it's stunning, but there's some mess about it too.
I think the engine on that works, and they've turned it on, and they practically blew them out of the room. So that piece, yes.
I agree. I think there's to me there's a little undercurrent of like maybe, you know, David Lynchian menace in some of this, and there was that work at Paula Cooper a few years ago that was a red scooter inside of a
Golden box.
golden box,
Like-
and that was like, to me, I mean, there was something very, very deathy going on about that or something. I don't know. Not
I thought it was
not
like
super.
some kind of like religious icon or something.
Yeah, I mean, it looked like a James Lee Byers, you know,
Oh.
gone crazy or something like that. But it was, to me, past a certain point, there is an undercurrent of a kind of, you know, menace in there a little bit. I don't know.
Anyone else? Yes.
Can you comment on his impulse for using a high gloss finish? Because all his other cars are usually like matted out and rough in a way that's very intentionally like worked on. And this one feels a lot closer apartmental than the car is, which seems intentional.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, but I think when people have brought up color, he says he's not that interested in color, and he's great with color. I mean, but you're right that I do think it's the first car that has a finish that really picks up the light.
And it feels to me, I never saw those really early pieces like Tenerife and those very early super painted pieces, which were high gloss paint, right? They were high gloss auto
Well, that's
paint.
another thing.
And
Back,
the color tone and also the finish seems to refer a little bit back to them.
Yeah.
I know I'm just saying that, but you know.
well, a lot of those pieces at the time, if you think about art magazines, et cetera, they're all reproduced in black and white. It was
Right.
shocking to me to see a piece that I'd always thought was sort of like white gray, to find out that it was like canary yellow, because there had never been a color picture for the longest time. But yes, I think it's his first car with a real finish.
I mean, he is an extraordinary colorist. It's almost like the color exists as a kind of reality in itself.
Yeah, I mean, that, you
Yeah,
know,
I mean, look at it. It's
look at
almost
it.
like it's
You know
you're
something
actually
else? There's
treating
one of
color
the
as
things I
natural.
find really interesting about art when it works, which is once you see it, you can't imagine it any other way. So I can't imagine any other color. It could be any other color. You just get your can of paint and all that. I think it has to be that color.
Yeah.
Yeah, in the back.
I was just thinking about the reflective nature of this car and the point of being theatrical. And since we don't have like a stage set here with the exception of this, could the reflection be drawing in the room, or that the matte automobiles are relating to each other, and this one is more relating to the room and having the room as an actor? Would that kind of make sense, or am I just thinking?
I mean, it does, because, I mean, even tonight, but certainly probably when you've got the daylight, you see the entire thing reflected in that car.
Yeah, yeah. It's all completely, and also I think the fact of the black line on the wall is kind of colluding with the space. He's kind of like sucking the space into the. There's a kind of totality that works. It's not just the car and the black line. These things are all so carefully done. And then I was wondering, did this used to be a car shop anyway? I mean, there's probably something going on there too. I don't know what the history of the space is.
Glassworks.
It was a Glassworks?
Well,
I was here when the car came in, and we turned the lights down for the talk, but the lights were all on as they are in a gallery. When he sees his work in a gallery, it's the first time he's seeing it outside of his place, which is much more natural. It looks, there's a lot of concrete pavement, and there are these sort of sheds and so on, and he sees it very often in daylight. And so it came in, and I saw all these bending reflections of light going around the curves, and I pointed it out to him. And the first thing he said is, "Oh, maybe we should turn the lights off." You know, like he had never seen that, like light bending all over, reflected in the finish. But what can you do about it?
That it wasn't an effect that he was really thinking about that much.
He hadn't seen it with bright light on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and further to that point about theatrics. So if we're operating on the assumption that Grosvenor is always operating that 15-year-old self, right?
Well, don't quote me, especially to him.
But, you know, you can play Macbeth as a young man or an old man, or even as a woman. And so there's this huge gap between the 25-year-old man looking at, or who has a young daughter making something, and looking at himself as a 15-year-old, or the 80-something-year-old guy as the 15-year-old. You know, it's still going into that theatrics, that part that he goes into, the reflection of the room, the stage set. You know, you can say he's but a poor player, that's runs and frets. I mean, can we frame it in that way?
Frame it in what way?
I guess about his different selves.
Saying that he's always operating under the duties of being a young man. Well, he's no longer, there's a larger difference mathematically between when you made that work and this work. There's a bigger time frame, and there's a different actor work.
Yeah. Although as an artist, there's only you and what you do, and the only you is you, you know, and you are the age you are, and you are, you know, and so in a sense, I feel like it's almost like he's going to just inevitably he's making work that's about who he is at this given moment, because that's who he is at this given moment. It's the only choice, right?
Yeah, but it does seem like he's more so than a lot of artists. There is that thing of that boyish thing of like he's just making this because he really, really wants to see what it looks like.
Yeah.
For himself, and hoping, I guess, that it works out in the world, but not really caring all that much.
I went back to this image because it's 68 to 70, but this was remade for a show a few years ago. I think he thought, okay, well, let's see it again. And it's probably, in this case, it was someone built it for him. It was the only time he didn't build it himself. And he thought, let's see it again. But it's also, he was really interested in how people related to it.
Yeah.
You know, did people go under it? You know, how
I
kids
think
were sort of playful
he
about
originally
it.
built that in his studio in Broome Street. There was a photo of him.
Yeah.
He'd actually built it
Well,
in this
just
quite
plywood.
small space, right? But it was like, it completely took up the entire space. You know, it was like almost wall to wall, and like the whole.
It's a thing too, when you look at that, you think, you know, sculptors were taking the object off the plinth, and he thought, well, I'll take it way off the plinth, up in the air.
You know, it was also a period when people were thinking, what else can sculpture be?
Right.
And what can it do? And, you know, it wasn't going to be on a pedestal, and it was going to take over the space, as you're saying from that old photo. I think he's still doing that, you know? I don't think he's operating any differently, really, in terms of his, you know, inquisitiveness and wanting to, like a lot of artists, they don't make something to show something, they make something to see it.
And also, I think in the way it interacts with people, like the door is tiny bit ajar. Like, I assume Bob did that, but you know, it's kind of like it makes you want to open the door. I mean, I'm sure with this work, as much as with that one, the way that people interact with the work, and you're constantly kind of almost wanting to, like, you know, you're wanting to get in.
You want to touch
I'm
it.
sure he knows that
Yeah.
that you're being pulled by this thing. You're actually, that there's this kind of very physical relationship with this thing, in much the same way, I suspect. This kind of,
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more, if there is one more.
How did the car make it inside? How did it go inside in one piece? Or?
There was somebody behind the wheel to do the steering. They removed a little bit of the wall because it wasn't wide enough to bring it in, and they took one of the fenders off because it wasn't wide enough, and the person steering was backed up by a number of people very slowly pushing it, with other people looking to make sure it wasn't scraping, and they got it in one shot.
And was it always going to be angled this way, or did he look at it?
I don't think it got moved around. I think he knew what he wanted.
He knew what he wanted.
You know, that's another thing, is he knew the room, he knew the object, and it came in, and it sort of sits as if, you know, if it was a garage and you brought it in for the night, it wasn't like, oh, let's try, you know, there's some artists, they would have made the poor people who work here move it around 10 times, and then they would have ended up where it was originally.
Right.
Bob doesn't have patience for that.
Right.
He knew that was right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks everybody again for coming.
Thanks.
And
Thank you.
here we go.
Thanks, Sean.